Have you ever wondered at what precise moment that elusive shift occurred in your relationship with your children? Think back to the years dedicated to raising them, the sleepless nights changing diapers, being there in moments of joy and sorrow. You sacrificed your weekends, vacations, and sometimes even personal aspirations to help them realize their cherished dreams. And now, when you try to say something, you are unceremoniously interrupted. Your advice, dictated by experience and love, is rejected with disdain. When you need support, they suddenly become incomprehensibly busy. But the most painful thing is the feeling that you have become invisible in their lives. If these feelings are familiar to you, then know that you are not alone in your experiences. Many parents reach a turning point in their lives when a kind of role reversal occurs. Once you were their reliable protector, a wise mentor, someone they turned to for any, even the most insignificant reason. But now it seems like they no longer see you as the person you once were. Sometimes their attitude towards you is more like that of a burden than a loving and caring parent. Or, even worse, they make you feel like a burden, a heavy load on their shoulders. And this heartache pierces much deeper than almost anything else, leaving an unhealed wound in your heart. But what happens next? Is this the end of close relationships? Stay with us to find out the answers. It is quite understandable to want to repay offenders in kind, to recall all your merits, to give vent to anger, or, on the contrary, to withdraw into yourself. However, paradoxically, attempts to forcefully gain respect rarely lead to the desired result. It is much more effective and dignified to act differently. We will talk about simple but effective steps that can radically change the attitude of children towards their parents, not through guilt or scandals, but through the demonstration of inner strength, the establishment of clear boundaries, and the expression of self-respect. These are not manipulations, but real changes in life that can restore lost dignity and restore the connection between generations. Let's start with a problem familiar to many: an excessive desire to please. Do parents often say yes when they want to say no, just to avoid conflict? Do they make all sorts of sacrifices for their children, even to the detriment of their own comfort, just so that they are not upset? Many parents do this without even realizing it. Perhaps they drastically change their plans to babysit their grandchildren, despite feeling unwell. Or they allow themselves to be spoken to in an inappropriate tone, just so as not to be known as a difficult person. It is important to understand, the stronger the desire to earn approval, the less respect it evokes. And it's not about ingratitude or bad intentions of children, but about human nature, which tends to value firmness, not constant concessions. Margaret's story is an instructive illustration of how good intentions can lead to unexpected consequences. This woman, who dedicated her life to raising 3 children, faced the fact that with age, her influence in the family began to weaken. Trying to maintain harmony, she gradually abandoned making decisions regarding her own home, health, and finances, believing that this would strengthen family ties. However, as is often the case, excessive compliance led to the opposite result. Children began to listen less to her opinion. Margaret sincerely believed that she was showing kindness, but in the eyes of her children, this looked like a sign that she no longer needed to be taken seriously. This example clearly demonstrates that respect is not a direct consequence of sacrifice. On the contrary, it grows out of self-respect. When a person constantly puts their interests in last place, they involuntarily broadcast to others the idea that their voice, needs, and time are not of particular importance. And people, as a rule, react to this signal accordingly. Therefore, if you recognize yourself in this story, it is important to realize the need for change. It's time to stop excessive concessions and start defending your interests. Having the right to say no is not a manifestation of selfishness, but a healthy boundary necessary to maintain self-respect. Don't be afraid to express your opinion when something seems wrong and take your place in life without guilt or the need to ask permission. Respect begins with you. The more you value your own boundaries, the more others will respect them. This does not mean that you need to become rude or insensitive, but only demonstrate to your loved ones that your time, energy, and presence have value, and that you are ready to stand firmly on your truth. Let's consider another strategy that seems intuitively understandable but rarely leads to the desired results: verbal battles. When someone takes a condescending tone, the natural reaction is to want to fight back. The impulse arises to retort, "How dare you talk to me like that?" Or, "Have you forgotten everything I've done for you?" While such a response may seem perfectly justified, it usually doesn't bring about any positive changes. Moreover, it often only exacerbates the situation, adding fuel to an already raging conflict. However, there is an approach that can radically change the dynamics of interaction. Instead of arguing, take on the role of a leader. When you react to disrespect with outbursts of anger or emotional outbursts, it shows that your inner world is still controlled by another person. But when you respond with restrained confidence and equanimity, it sends a completely different signal. It demonstrates, "I don't need to raise my voice. I am well aware of my value and significance." As an example, I can cite the story of Frank, a retired teacher I knew. For decades, students in the classroom treated him with deep respect, but at home, his adult children barely bothered to listen to his opinion. They casually interrupted him, ignored his concerns, and even ridiculed his suggestions. At first, Frank tried to resist this kind of treatment. Every conversation turned into a heated debate, and every disagreement ended in a loud quarrel. And yet, despite all his efforts, the situation remained unchanged. A turning point came in Frank's narrative when he consciously refused to continue fighting for recognition. Continuing to share his views, he did so with peaceful dignity, not seeking to win the argument at any cost. He stopped pursuing the respect of his children, beginning to radiate it by his own behavior, as if he no longer had anything to prove to the world. And then a surprising transformation occurred. Frank's children began to notice the change in their father. They began to listen more attentively to his words, not because his voice became louder, but because he stopped participating in the age-old game of who's who. The point is that you don't have to desperately fight for respect. It's enough to simply live in accordance with it. Let your inner peace become your indestructible strength. Let your even and confident tone carry your power. You don't need to waste energy convincing your children of your worth. They will feel it in your presence, in every action you take. And there is another truth that may seem bitter, but in reality, it is liberating. You should not hold children responsible for satisfying your emotional needs. This does not mean that you do not love them with all your heart. On the contrary, your love is boundless. However, the more you depend on their assessment, the more distorted the dynamics of your relationship become. People, including our own children, respect those who have emotional independence. When the source of your happiness and peace of mind is inside you and does not depend on the frequency of calls, displays of affection, or the help they provide, children begin to perceive you completely differently. They see not someone who desperately clings to the past, but a person whose life is full of meaning and content. The image of Helen, a woman with an open heart who dedicated herself to raising children, comes to mind. However, when the children grew up and left home, she was overcome with deep sadness. She languished, waiting for phone calls, dialed their numbers every day, pouring out her longing for them. The children, in turn, began to distance themselves. Helen couldn't understand why her love wasn't being reciprocated. One day, she decided to shift her attention to herself. She signed up for dance classes, resumed meeting friends in cafes, returned to reading and drawing, and learned to laugh again. And surprisingly, the phone in her house rang more often. The children began to take an interest in her life, missing her herself, and not just her care. Now she wasn't begging for their attention, but attracting them with her rich existence. Therefore, if someone feels pain in their chest from a lack of calls or a quiet sadness from rare visits, it is important to remember that a person's value is not determined by the amount of attention they receive, but comes from within. The brighter the inner light, the stronger others are drawn to it, showing respect and constancy. When a person begins to emotionally distance themselves, not out of anger, but out of a sense of self-worth, a transformation occurs. Children stop seeing them as someone who craves their approval and begin to perceive them as a person who knows their worth, possessing depth, confidence, and imperturbable strength. This change may be barely noticeable at first, but it is real and becomes obvious over time. However, for a genuine restoration of past respect, something else of equal importance is needed: clear boundaries executed with love. Boundaries are not impenetrable walls or alienation from those around you, but rather teaching other people how to treat you with dignity. And paradoxically, many adult children sometimes cross boundaries not out of deliberate disrespect, but because these boundaries were not clearly defined from the start. It's worth considering if children constantly interrupt a parent, make important decisions without their participation, or allow themselves to speak in a tone that makes the parent feel belittled. It is most likely not because of their cruelty, but because such behavior was at some point condoned and not properly corrected. Perhaps this happened not out of weakness, but out of love or a desire to avoid conflict. But here's what's important. Love without boundaries can turn into resentment, and silence is eventually perceived as tacit permission. As an example, consider the story of Robert. As a successful businessman in retirement, he exuded self-confidence in any society and enjoyed universal respect among colleagues. However, at home, in communication with his adult children, the situation changed dramatically. They casually interrupted him mid-sentence, rolled their eyes when he gave advice, and talked to him as if he didn't understand life at all. At first, Robert tried to ignore it, believing that the children were simply experiencing stress or fatigue. But with each of his silences, they went further and further. One evening during dinner, one of the sons abruptly cut him off for how he was telling an ordinary story. That memorable night, something transformative happened. Robert, contrary to his usual habit, did not raise his voice or reproach his loved ones. He patiently waited for the wave of emotions to subside, and then spoke words full of calm, but at the same time unwavering determination. I don't expect you to unconditionally agree with me, but I insist on respectful communication. Otherwise, I will be forced to end such discussions. After these words, silence reigned, but something significant was felt in the air. He did not resort to threats or fruitless arguments, but simply outlined the boundaries of what was permissible, making it clear that such behavior was unacceptable to him. Over time, this approach bore fruit. His children realized that their father was completely serious. They were not deprived of the opportunity to communicate with him, but now they had to earn his attention and participation. Respect became an integral part of their relationship, arising not from demands, but thanks to clearly defined boundaries. Boundaries are not an instrument of control, but a way to bring clarity. When boundaries are clearly defined, the people around you, even your own children, begin to behave differently. They realize that your time, energy, and communication are a value that cannot be taken for granted, but must be cherished and protected. There is another common behavior pattern that is often overlooked, especially by parents: the habit of giving selflessly without receiving anything in return. This refers to situations when you offer help, give advice, sacrifice your time and energy, and sometimes even money, simply because you have always done so. Perhaps deep down you don't expect anything in return, but it's still painful when your efforts go unnoticed, when a simple "thank you" is not heard, when people take your help for granted, take and take, without asking about your condition and needs. The desire to help others is a natural human quality that does not weaken with age. However, it is important to understand that limitless generosity, without measure and without gratitude, can lead to undesirable consequences. Instead of strengthening love and respect, it teaches others to perceive help as a given, as something self-evident. Over time, your kindness turns into a familiar background that they stop noticing, As an example, consider the story of George, a father of 3 who was always ready to help. He readily lent money, responded to requests for help with moving or repairs. Even in his declining years, he put aside his own affairs to look after his grandchildren. But when he himself needed help after a minor operation, none of his children offered to stay with him. Everyone had their own urgent matters. This moment became a turning point in George's life. Instead of being offended or reproaching his children, he took a pause to reflect on what had happened, and made a balanced decision. He stopped automatically answering yes to any requests. Now he only helped in those cases when it was really necessary and when his help was truly appreciated. George did not become embittered. He simply gained clarity and established healthy boundaries. Over time, the offspring began to notice a change in their parents' behavior. Their requests for assistance were met with responses full of regret, but invariably accompanied by excuses about prearranged plans or conditions that shifted some of the responsibility onto their shoulders. At first, this caused them bewilderment and even annoyance, but soon gratitude began to blossom in their hearts. After all, help was no longer taken for granted, but became a precious gift. The truth is that when a person retreats to such a distance that others feel the burden of their absence, they begin to appreciate their presence in a new way. There is no need to abandon kindness, but boundless kindness can be a disservice to both the giver and the receiver. And as we contemplate this, it is worth taking a moment to recognize a fundamental truth. A parent is not only a caregiver, but also an individual with their own aspirations, dreams, time, and unique character. And one of the most inspiring and healing things you can do for both your children and yourself is to build a life that extends beyond parental duties. The author realizes that this idea may seem paradoxical at first glance. Perhaps for many years, the family has been the top priority, and the person has convinced themselves that they will start taking care of themselves when the children settle down in life. But now that they have grown up and entered a new stage, it is time to ask yourself, what fills your own cup of life? When parents demonstrate a fulfilling life rather than simply waiting, children admire them, gravitate toward them, and show respect based not on guilt, but on recognition of dignity and purposefulness. Parents exist not only to serve the needs of their children, but also to live a full life, to return to hobbies and interests that may have been temporarily forgotten. Whether it's attending educational courses, learning a new hobby, traveling, meeting up with old friends, or simply having the opportunity to enjoy the morning at your own pace, parents have the right to prioritize their own happiness. When this happens, children begin to see their parents not just as mom or dad, but as a complete, vibrant personality, a person with their own history, strength, and light. Changes in parental behavior, the ability to express one's needs, set healthy boundaries, and reject outdated expectations lead to tangible results. Tension eases, and the heaviness in the heart diminishes. There is no longer a need to tiptoe around hoping for recognition. Parents regain confidence not because the children have suddenly changed, but because the parents themselves have changed. This is the essence. Respect cannot be demanded by force. It can only be inspired by one's way of life. When parents begin to live with greater self-respect, everything else begins to fall into harmony. Let's delve into a simple but often overlooked truth. A person's value is determined not by their contributions or achievements, but by the very fact of their existence. The world and loved ones need a confident, balanced, and calm version of that person. That version does not sacrifice itself to maintain peace, but lovingly defends its truth. Such a transformation changes everything around. Observations show how the children's reactions change. Perhaps they will call more often, speak more warmly, ask for opinions, and listen attentively. This is not a coincidence, but the result of restoring one's place in the relationship, based not on demands or guilt, but on presence, dignity, and self-respect. But even if changes do not happen instantly, do not lose hope. People need time to adapt. They are used to the version of the person who always agreed, remained silent, or selflessly gave, asking nothing in return. Changing this dynamic can cause discomfort, both for those around and for the person themselves. However, this discomfort is part of the growth process, and the result is worth the effort. Love and respect are two different concepts that should not be confused. It is possible to have deep feelings for your children while setting certain boundaries. A parent can wholeheartedly care about the well-being of their child, but at the same time have every right to say, "I will not tolerate such treatment towards me." Such behavior is not a manifestation of cruelty, but rather a sign of healthy and mature relationships. Often, such changes not only change the attitude of others, but also strengthen the bond between people. When children see that a parent values themselves and their interests, it encourages them to show mutual respect. Observing a parent leading a fulfilling life, engaging in their favorite activities, socializing with friends, and confidently expressing their point of view, children develop genuine admiration based not on a sense of duty, but on genuine respect. In this regard, it is worth asking yourself, in what situations does a person give away their power? Perhaps it manifests as constant agreement, even when you want to say no, or in silence when your voice deserves to be heard. Or maybe it's waiting for approval from others to feel good about yourself. Regardless of how it manifests, it's necessary to start addressing it. It's about the need to stand up for your boundaries and self-respect. Perhaps this will be expressed in simply declining a meeting if you already have other plans, or in firmly stating the inadmissibility of a disrespectful tone in conversations with loved ones. It could also be realizing a long-held dream of traveling, joining a group of interest, or returning to a forgotten hobby. It's important to remember that a small step is enough to start. There is no need to strive for perfection or infallibility. The main thing is to start valuing your own voice, time, and dignity. It is from this that the path to well-deserved respect begins. If these words resonate with a person, if they are familiar with the quiet pain of feeling ignored or underestimated, even by their own children, then it is important to realize that they deserve better, not for past merits, but simply because they exist. And if a person is willing to listen to themselves and look inside, this speaks to their strength and courage, which means they are already on the right path to the respect they deserve.